Of course. I'm on the lapel. Yeah, thanks. I hope you'll excuse me for this little technology break. It won't be long. Good morning.
Good morning.
Can you hear me okay at the back? Is this microphone working? No, it's not. Let me... Does this thing work? I actually like hand holding.
It works fine.
Okay. I'm on.
If you want to hold.
Oh, switch off the lapel, yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. How's that now? Thank you so much. Look, I'm glad that I've been given the opportunity to introduce not myself so much, but the ministry, because many people may not know what Creation Ministries International is. We're actually a group of 6 ministries in 6 different countries that cooperate together, and we share the same website, the same magazine, Creation Magazine, the same Journal of Creation, and it sort of makes us look a lot bigger than we are, and between us we employ more PhD scientists than any Christian ministry in the world. And we do that because we see ourselves as an information ministry called to arm and equip and encourage God's people in the face of all of those evolutionary challenges and attacks on the faith, you know, the latest ape man and millions of years and those sorts of things. What about sure you know what I mean, and because you've got relationships with them, and then the fact that you see that's where we don't get some testimony of someone saying, by the way, I became a Christian as a result of somebody sharing a book or a magazine with me, and one of the most powerful of the books is the Creation Answers book, because it answers 60 questions in categories like the ones I mentioned, but also dinosaurs, how do they fit the Bible, radiocarbon dating, continental drift, the Ice Age, how does it all fit together? How does the Bible connect to the real world is, in one sense, what this is about, because it's so easy to sort of lock ourselves away from you know, the Creation Answers book. What really excites me is that that's also available free on the internet. On our website you can download each chapter individually as a PDF, and it excites me because people in countries that can't afford books and magazines and things like this can access that information. And our website has over 9,000 articles, and there's a new one added every day, and a powerful search engine and video clips and all sorts of things. There's only one problem with it. Do you think you can remember that? I know it's tough, but I think you can. You know, we don't just try challenges in the media, but and in just a moment, the wonderful people from the Friends of CMI in the ACT, and we've got Friends volunteer groups in every capital city in Australia, and they give up their weekends because they know the importance of arming and equipping believers, because many of them, like me, have had their lives transformed and been brought to Christ as a result of breaking down these cultural evolutionary barriers to the gospel. So there's a form going to come around that looks like that. It actually also asks you for your postcode, and the reason for that is so that we don't send you stuff meant for South Africa or Singapore, but only for this part of the world. So while I'm talking, perhaps the guys from the Friends group could hand those boards around, please. And one of the important things that you need to deal with in this issue, and it's true for whatever church you go to, that there's a tendency for people to think, well, I know Jesus loves me, and I know God is creator, but what if, in other words, what does it really matter? Shouldn't we be on about the gospel and so on? The atheists understand what the issue is. One of them, Professor William Provine, is a professor at the famous Cornell University. He's a biologist, and he says this. He says, belief in modern evolution makes atheists of people. One can have a religious view that is compatible with evolution only if the religious view is indistinguishable from atheism. And in case anyone here thinks that's a bit over the top, I think he's being very logical. I was an atheist all the way through uni because of this one issue. And when you boil down what is taught as fact and assumed as fact in just about every subject, it's essentially this. Now, students, hydrogen is a gas which, if left long enough, turns into people. That's it. That's all there is. People might argue about the mechanism of how it happened, but the idea is that, there was a big bang that came from absolutely nothing, and then stars and galaxies and planets formed by their own processes and properties. Where they got those from, nobody cares to explain. And then eventually everything else, this complex, amazing world that we have today, arose from that. Prominent atheists were often brought up as Christians. One of them is the famous or infamous Richard Dawkins, and he was interviewed once on a Christian television station in the United Kingdom. And what I'm getting at here, of course, is that because he's been brought up as a Christian, he understands, at least sort of, what the gospel teaches, what it's about. It's not that he hasn't heard it. It's that he's rejected it, and he recognizes that efforts to mix and match Christianity and evolution are frankly hopeless. The interviewer asked him this: was there a particular point or something that you... there never... And most in the church, even some of the good, solid theologians had given way on that issue and said it doesn't matter, it's a side issue, and who cares how long ago God created. So in other words, it was formed slowly and gradually. Now, before that idea became popular, all the scientists, the fathers of modern geology, even the great Sir Isaac Newton, the greatest scientist who ever lived, had made three whole chapters telling us about a massive globe-covering watery catastrophe, the flood of Noah. It says that before it began to rain, all the fountains of the great deep were broken up, and it took a year before Noah and his family were able to set foot on dry. And he was a Scottish lawyer, and he said, idea sand in the base. Over the sandstone layer, 1,000,000 millimeters. So that means that takes a year, so that's 1,000,000 years. That's very, very roughly the idea. Do you know what I mean? So he said, no, you're not allowed to postulate that there were speeded up things, that there were massive catastrophes in the past, or, particularly the big one, Noah's flood. No, you've got to say continuing as they were, is how the Bible puts it, is enough to explain all of geology. So of course it eliminates the idea of the Genesis flood. And in his private correspondence, Lyell wrote that it's not a good idea to attack Christianity head on. He was a deist, very much anti-biblical Christianity. A deist believes in sort of a vague God that created. And he eventually became a friend of Charles Darwin. He wasn't of his book on geology with him in the book, convinced Darwin that there was all these millions of years, that there was plenty of time for all of this evolutionary idea to happen. Now, Lyell also about geology from Moses. So it's a direct sort of frontal undermining of that. And it's interesting that in hindsight, an evolutionist, a professor of geology and the history of science, Stephen Jay Gould from Harvard University, has passed away recently. He said this. He said Charles Lyell was a lawyer. He used true bits of cunning to impose this idea. And he says the catastrophists were much more empirically minded. What does that mean? They took more notice of things like observations or experiments. And it says Lyell imposed his imagination upon the evidence. But he persuaded people that it was a trendy thing to believe in this millions of years. And so many people started thinking, well, I see millions of years when I look at the fossils. So that's easy. I'll just add it to the Bible. And so some ideas, even well-meaning, arose as to how the Bible could accommodate millions of years. Now, let me say this, that all the great scholars of the past didn't see the millions of years in the Bible. Nobody saw any of these things. What am I talking about? Different theories, like the day-age theory that tries to stretch the days into millions of years, or these days theistic evolution, or the gap theory in which you say there's a gap between Genesis 1:1 and 1:2, and you say, let's put the millions of years there. It was a well-meaning idea. It was an idea that said, here's a problem, how do we solve it? But in the process, big problem, because it didn't stop to think about some of the issues which I'll hopefully work through. By the way, all of these different theories, obviously they can't all be right, but they have one thing pretty well in common, that they have a difficulty with the idea of a global flood. Now, some of them are overtly local flood, but really, if you think about it, if there was a worldwide flood, if there was any sort of millions of years beforehand, and if the fossil record is the evidence for that, then a global flood, by the sheer laws of physics, would have destroyed all that evidence. So it's either the flood or it's millions of years, And of course people then say, well, maybe the flood didn't cover the whole world, and maybe the word day doesn't really mean day. So, here's what's interesting. Any 10-year-old child can tell you what Genesis is teaching. It's really not that difficult. And that's the reason why, over the years, if you look back at the evangelical commentaries, before the millions of years idea became popular, they argue about all sorts of other things. But they never once argue about the millions of years or the global nature of the flood, because it's so clear, so mind-blowingly obvious. But not only the 10-year-olds, but the Hebrew professors agree with them. What do I mean? I'm not talking about someone who's done a year or two of Hebrew at university. I'm talking about people who are the heads of department at Yale, Princeton, Harvard, Cambridge, and so on. And I'm going to quote from one of them. Now, like most of these professors, he doesn't believe that Genesis is true, okay? But when we're trying to understand the Bible, the fundamental thing is, what was the writer trying to tell us? In other words, was he saying that Jesus literally and physically rose from the dead? Obviously the answer is yes. They're sort of basically the rules of Bible understanding. So even an atheist can be involved in telling us that. Anyway, here's one of these people that doesn't believe that Genesis is history. His name is Professor James Barr. Why am I quoting a non-Christian? Because he's not on our side. Do you see what I mean? Because it's like a hostile witness in a court of law. The best thing a lawyer can do is to get a hostile witness to make an admission which favours your case. Here's what Professor Barr wrote. He said, probably so far as I know, there is no professor of Hebrew or Old Testament at any world-class university who does not believe that the writers, he thinks there was more than one, of Genesis 1 to 11, intended to convey to their readers what? The idea that creation took place in 6 days, same as the days of 24 hours we now experience. In Hebrew, when that word these guys are a little bit thick, and I'm going to have to make this. I'm going to have to make this point several times. So there was evening, there was morning, the nth day, and so on. And then Barr goes on. He says the figures in the genealogies, the begat, begat, begat. They might seem a bit boring, but they're there for a reason, like everything else in Scripture. And it tells you how old Adam was when his descendant was born. See, it doesn't matter if you argue about whether the descendant was a grandson or great-grandson. Makes no difference at all, because it actually then tells you how old that descendant was when his descendant was born and how old this one was. It's an unbroken chain. And so that means what? By simple addition, the chronology from the beginning of the world. So he's talking no gap. You see, there's actually a special joining word called a vav disjunctive between Genesis 1:1 and 1:2 that eliminates the idea of a gap. It actually joins those two together. It's like God went out of his way to make that point up to later stages in the biblical story. Thirdly, Noah's flood was global. I mean, why else would birds have to go on board? I mean, if it's a local flood, it just makes no sense, because birds just have to fly across to the nearest mountain range, isn't that right? You know, but you know, you still have people who will say, well, the word day in Genesis and Hebrew yom, that doesn't have to mean an ordinary day. That sometimes means a long indefinite period of time, as if it's some amazing discovery. But you know what? Do you think that the Hebrew professors don't know that? Because you see, it's exactly the same in English. We have meanings of the word day which don't mean an ordinary day. In my father's day, it took 6 days to drive across Australia during the day. There's 3 different meanings of the word day, but guess what? You knew exactly what I meant each time, didn't you? And you know, it was completely unmistakable. And what I like to do is, when I preach a number of overseas countries, particularly Southeast Asia, and I say, look, there's lots of people here who speak different languages. There's a few here today probably, and your mother tongue is something different. And I said, I don't care whether it's Hakka, Teochew, Putonghua, or Tagalog, or Cebuano, whatever. But I guarantee you that in that language of yours, if I said to you, it took me 6 days to build this tool shed, there is no way that you could understand that as meaning the word day is indefinite period of time. And they all nod. And then I say, well, of course not, because it would be a logical absurdity, because 6 indefinite periods of time is 1 indefinite period of time anyway. And look how God uses the word 6 days in inscription in stone as part of the 10 Commandments with his own finger. Not just inspired by God, but inscribed by God. Exodus 20:11, part of the Sabbath commandment to the Israelites. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that in them is, and rested the 7th day. And then, you know, in that same passage about the Sabbath commandment, he says we should work for 6 days and rest on the 7th day. Now, if the word day here means something else other than an ordinary day, it would be the only time in all of known Hebrew literature that the same word is used in the same sentence in a different way, in the same passage in a different way, even though it's used in the same sense, and there's not a single indication in the text of a change of meaning. Now, I've spent a fair bit of time on that. Let me tell you that even if I was absolutely convinced, as I am, that this is the correct meaning, it still wouldn't be an important enough issue for me to have given up a medical practice and spend my life going town after town, church after church, country after country. But the reason is because it is an issue that's foundational to the gospel, because there's much more to it than the length of a day. You see, if all of those things were formed over millions of years, here's the problem. Well, that means the fossils are millions of years old, which means they must have existed before Adam and Eve. Do you agree? If they're millions of years old. But what do the fossils show? They show you death, pain, because there's evidence of things biting and eating each other, There's evidence of disease, lots of diseases, the same sort that still afflict people and animals, cancer, abscesses, arthritis, gout, all of that in the fossil record. And here's God saying he saw everything he made, and behold, it was all very good. Everything he'd made. So that's it really strikes at the heart of the nature of God, doesn't it? But it also turns the logic of the gospel upside down, because it puts the curse before the fall. And let me tell you that of all the objections that people have to the biblical God, or claim to have, the biggest one is this issue of why would a loving God create a world full of death and suffering? The Bible gives us a straightforward, big picture approach to that. It says that death is not God's normality, that God created a world which really was all very good in the beginning. Even the animals ate plants. There's no indication of a previous creation where they ate each other and then they suddenly started eating plants. Because a lot of those animals that you dig up with the dinosaurs are the same sorts of animals that you still have today, parrots and a badger and a duck and all sorts of things like that. The Bible regards death uniformly in the same way. There is a total consistency in Scripture right throughout the Old and New Testament that death is an intruder into a once perfect world. You see, it's not that the New Testament so much teaches on it, but takes it for granted, because it assumes that you've read the first bit. You see, Paul, in 1 Corinthians 15, he says, the last enemy that should be destroyed is death. Death is an enemy. Death is not, in that sense, God's normality. You see, there's a huge difference between God judging a world because of his intense reaction to or hatred of sin, showing you how incredibly serious sin is, and just for a time, and then restoring it through Christ. There's a big difference between that and if God superintended millions of years, even without evolution, of death, pain and bloodshed. Big difference. Let me say that this whole big picture of the gospel is a good world, ruined by sin, to be restored in the future through Jesus Christ. And it's right throughout there. For instance, in Romans 8, Paul assumes that you know what he's talking about when he says, for the creature, the created thing, was made subject to vanity. He's talking about the Genesis curse. When he talks about the future restoration, what Acts calls the liberation of all things, or restitution of all things, the creature itself also shall be delivered from the bondage of corruption. What caused the bondage of corruption? The Genesis curse. And if you still haven't got the point, he then says that the whole creation... And you know what? It's no wonder that virtually all the great preachers of the past, Spurgeon, Wesley, Calvin, you name it, they took it for granted that the current world of bloodshed and disease is not the way things started off and not the way it's going to be. We go to churches, and so obviously there are differences of opinion about the fine details of the future. But we all agree, and I trust we all do, why do we Scripture? Because it says in Revelation 21, between the Genesis curse and the future lifting of the curse. Can you see how Genesis, far from being a side issue, is sort of like a key that unlocks the whole big picture, that ties it all together from beginning to end? Can you see how it's foundational to the gospel? What is the gospel ultimately? It's God's solution to the twin problems of sin and death. So what is Genesis all about? How sin and death entered the universe. Isn't Satan clever. If you want to demolish a house, is the most efficient way to do that to put your dynamite charges up around the gutter? No, it's you take it out the foundations. You destroy the logic of it. You know, a university chaplain wrote to us and he said, this constant brainwashing destroys the faith of many Christians each year. According to our surveys, he said, they indicate that 80% of first-year students believe in a God who's there. By their second year, only 15% believe in God. You know, the Southern Baptists are the biggest denomination, Protestant denomination in the world. Your pastor would be very familiar with that group. They did a survey on the children in their homes and they found that the figures showed that 88% of those kids raised in evangelical homes were going to leave the church at the age of 18, never to return. Other groups have done surveys, they go, depending what criteria you use, 65%, but you know, it's like the odds are 2 to 1 in favour of young people today leaving the church. You know, it's got a lot to do with the fact that we live in a culture where a totally different history of the world, a history in which there's always been millions of years every single subject and to every news report just about. Jesus put it well. He said, if I've told you earthly things and you believe not, how shall you believe if I tell you of heavenly things? You know, now, he was speaking in a different context, but it's the same principle. And how can we expect people to believe the Bible about faith, morality and salvation if at the same time we're giving the impression that we either don't believe or don't care or don't know how to defend the Bible's history? Because you see, all of the salvation story is told in a context of history and reality, isn't it? You know, Paul said that if Jesus Christ did not physically, literally, historically, really, scientifically rise from the dead, for example, then it's all for nothing. It's just all in vain. You know, the Bible says that the gospel is that Jesus Christ died for our sins, was buried and raised again according to the Scriptures. So there's a whole context in that. Jesus just doesn't suddenly appear out of nowhere. He has an ancestry. His ancestry is traced all the way back to Adam. You know, what are we supposed to be doing? Are we supposed to be ignoring the arguments in our culture that, you know, is it godly to just forget about what's going on out there? It's permeating all the internet and what kids are getting at school and all the rest of it. You know, the apostles didn't do that. I mean, Peter, for instance, in 1 Peter 3:15, he made it clear we're not supposed to be argumentative. We're supposed to be ready to give an answer, but do that with meekness and fear, you know, be gentle, be respectful. We can't argue people into heaven, but that does not mean we're to duck the arguments in our culture, because the apostles themselves were doing that. They were engaging the arguments of our culture. Paul says in 2 Corinthians 10:5, this is what they were doing, casting down imaginations and every high thing that exalteth itself against the knowledge of God. You know, demolishing these arguments in our culture, opposing these things that oppose God. Gently and respectfully, to be sure. But, you know, we're going to see today, I trust, in these sessions to come, that it's actually an exciting time to be a Christian, that there is a lot of evidence, and that it makes a lot of sense. You see, unlike a lot of preaching today, Paul never appealed to the emotions of his hearers. He reasoned with them from the Scriptures. He reasoned from reality. He said, for instance, to King Agrippa, he said, "O King, these things were not done in a corner." What's the context? Well, the king would have known that all of Jerusalem was buzzing with the fact that there were these hundreds of people that claimed to have seen, spoken and risen to the living, spoken with the risen Christ alive. And that if the Jewish or Roman authorities could produce the body, they would do so in a heartbeat. So Paul Paul wasn't calling for a blind leap of faith in the dark like a lot of people think of faith these days. He wasn't saying, I can prove this to you, but you know what? These things were not done in a corner. This is not some dumb thing you're being asked to believe. This is something that makes sense, that's reasonable. You know, what did Agrippa say? Almost thou persuadest me to be a Christian. You know, remember I said at the beginning about Anthony Flew? I'll just give you a little taste before the 2 sessions this afternoon. Remember I said about Anthony Flew, who changed his mind? By the way, he didn't take the next step. He died before, you know, God is not mocked. He spent his life opposing God. But he did say, look, that logic now demands that you have to accept that there has to be at least some sort of designing intelligence behind life. And let me explain that point. You see, kids today, they cut up a frog, right? And they learn that, no, there's nothing spooky inside frogs, and that's right. And everything inside frogs obeys the laws of physics and chemistry. And so they start to get the impression that, if only you had the right raw materials to mix it all together, then life would somehow pop out of a test tube. In other words, life could have formed itself in that way. Do you know that some of the leading theorists, evolutionists, unbelievers, they're trying to work out how that could have happened? They know it's not like that. They know the problem is not the right raw materials, it's something else. This is what one of them says, Dr. Paul Davies, very famous man, and he said, most of the workings of the cell are best described not in terms of material stuff or hardware, but as information or software. In other words, we all know what that means these days. Information, we play with it all the time with our USBs and our floppy drives, what we used to have, and that sort of thing. And what does he mean by that? You see, inside the cell, it might look like a blob of jelly under a simple microscope, but now that we can look much more deeply and we can understand more, we see that the cell runs on programmed machinery. See, when a cell divides, it's not like a soap bubble dividing under the laws of physics and chemistry. It's like a little factory that's got all these gadgets and machines, and they're all driven by programmed mechanisms. You know, let me just show you 2 of the amazing machines inside living things. The first thing I'll show you is called the kinesin molecule. It's like a little molecule that walks, and when you see it walking, I want you to realize that every step is so small that it takes 125,000 of them to cover 1 millimeter. Okay, now it's called the Warfare of the cell, or longshoreman, and that's because it carries on its back this bag of protein. So let's see if we can get this thing to walk. It should start walking any minute. Yes. There it is. There it is. It's carrying those things on its back. And see these little tags sticking out? They're like postcodes that tell it where to drop off its load. And if you could look in the background, all these other little cables here, there's thousands and thousands of these things walking around, purposefully transporting that equipment. What makes kinesin do what it does? Is it the raw materials? Is it the laws of physics and chemistry? It obeys the laws of physics and chemistry, but raw materials will never give you a kinesin molecule. Because you see, that's just a protein. A protein is a chain of amino acids. They're like chemical alphabet letters. There's only 20 letters of these amino acids. Now you put them together in just be nothing, just useless goo. Put them together in another sequence, it'll be insulin that controls blood sugar. Put them in another sequence and it'll be kinesin that walks along. Put them in a different sequence and it's egg white that just sits there but provides great nutrition. So what is it? The sequence of the symbols. What sequence of symbols? It's information. That's another way of saying information. Where does information come from? Well, you can program a computer to program another computer, to program a robot, to program another computer, but the first one in that chain has to come from mind. There is no exception to that in science. It's not What we don't know is what we do know about science that tells us that these things have to be information driven. They are information driven. Where does the information come from a living cell to make the kinesin? From the DNA. Where did that come from? From grandfather and grandmother and mother and father organisms and so on. But every time you see that information copied and transmitted, as we'll see later on today, it gets corrupted or lost, if anything. It never increases by itself. Let me show you another amazing machine inside our cells. Now this machine is the ATP synthase motor. It makes ATP, the energy currency of the cell, and it's embedded in the membrane there. You've got thousands of these in each of your trillions of cells, and it spins at 10,000 revolutions per minute, driven by an electric charge of positive things called protons, not a negative one called electron. And it takes a molecule of ADP, tacks a phosphate on it, turns it into ATP, which your body can use for energy, and every time it spits out 3 of these molecules. Remember, it's rotating at 10,000 revs per minute. And you are so dependent upon these little gadgets, moment by moment, these little electric motors, that the reason why you drop dead within seconds of taking a big enough dose of cyanide is because the cyanide interferes with these tiny motors. And that's how second by second you're dependent. Great sermon material there about, our daily dependence on the Lord. But here's the key. And David, he's an atheist, but he knows it. He says, how did stupid atoms spontaneously write their own software? Because that's really the issue of the origin of life. And remember, Darwinism doesn't help you, because the Darwinian mechanism only works, theoretically, once you have a cell that's capable of making copies of itself. So natural selection and mutation, they only work when you've got a copying cell. So you've got to have a machine already that is so complicated that it can make copies of itself. Davies says nobody knows. Now, it's not one of those areas where maybe we'll know next year, because Davies also says there is no known law of physics able to create information from nothing. So I say, if anyone is wanting to be an atheist, well, you're still free to do that, but then you need to recognize that you're doing that not only by faith, but based upon a peculiarly blind form of faith, one that believes with no evidence that somehow that there's going to be a brand new law of physics discovered that nobody has any clue about. What's the point of all this? To arm, to equip, to encourage, to get people involved, to get the information out there, because unfortunately, because of over more than 100 years, there's been a cultural retreat of the church in general from this issue. We don't want to do it. We've solved the problem with this theory or that theory, and we don't want to get involved in that sort of thing. And so in a sense, we've lost the microphone in our culture. Jesus, when he was preaching on marriage, he based all of his teaching on those literal historical events in Genesis. Haven't you read? What was he talking about? In Genesis, I'm paraphrasing, of course. And, for instance, he said that God created the male and female from the beginning of creation. So when I was an atheist, it was obvious to me that Jesus believed not only in a literal Adam and Eve, but in a young world. How do I know that? Because if you believe in the millions of years, doesn't matter which of those theories you hold to, then you're saying that the creation process began long time ago, and people have only appeared relatively recently on that time scale. Jesus puts them at the beginning of creation, which makes sense in a biblical time scale of 6,000 years, and they're there just a few days right there at the beginning. That's at the beginning of creation. He also says in Luke, talks about the blood of righteous Abel and all the prophets. His blood was shed from the foundation of the world. But we put people at the end of this long creation process if we accept a billions of years old universe. And that's pretty serious. There were some beautiful hymns this morning, But if we say, revive us again, and we wonder, Lord, why isn't revival coming? Maybe issues like this, where the authority of the Bible is so clearly at stake, are important. Jesus said, and for this cause, still talking about marriage, a man shall leave his father and mother, and the twain shall be one flesh. What's the connection between Adam and Eve and one flesh? Well, let me finish with just a little aside here. You remember in Genesis where Adam says, this is now bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. Eve was made from Adam's rib. In marriage, we are emotionally and metaphorically at least supposed to be so close to one another as if we really were one flesh, because Adam and Eve literally and historically were one flesh, weren't they? But here's the little aside. I trained as a medical doctor, as some of you may know. I'm not practicing anymore. I've sort of got the hang of it now. And some time ago, I had a very serious car accident. I fell asleep at the wheel in the outback of Australia and went headlong at highway speeds into an oncoming fully laden fuel tanker. Not recommended. And spent 5.5 months in the Royal Adelaide Hospital and had a total of 56 operations, and most of them to rebuild my face and so on with bits of bone, so what you see is not what you get. And one day I'd had lots of these ops and I was in the hospital still, and the plastic surgeon came to my bedside and he said, Dr. Wieland, we're going to do another op tomorrow. We're going to go through the same scar, same side, take some more bone, and this time we'll put it in your nose. And I said, you guys keep going through the same side there to get bone. Why don't you go around the other side? I mean, aren't you going to run out of bone there soon, And he looked at me a bit strangely, as if, didn't they teach you anything in medical school? And he said, didn't you know we take the whole... I said, huh? And he said, didn't you know the river's... got with a defective rib cage the rest of his life. It grew straight back. But anyway, he had the capacity to help after every meeting we do, and this year we're probably going to have done around Australia alone over 500, and after every one we have a little report, and the other speakers get to see the reports from all the speakers. And one of our speakers is Rod Walsh. He was at a small Victorian church meeting, and he said total of 3 different people came up to him after the message and said that Creation magazine was responsible for their conversion. Unlike the email newsletter, it's not free, but can I encourage you not to see this as a way of supporting the ministry? If you're thinking of giving a donation, I'd much rather you had this, because that way I know that there's a good chance that some of those bits of information you get in that, beautifully presented, you'll be able to share. I mean, here's a lady who said when it arrives in the mail, her sons-in-law get excited. Not sure if she does, but she says, I'm so thrilled to witness their excitement. Thank you. The information empowers Christians to share the gospel, which is what it's about. A man in June 2011, he said, I was converted when someone gave me Creation magazine. Then I subscribed for 5 of my relatives. 4 of them have now come to the Lord. Now I know we can't promise you that strike rate every time, but the more that we get it out there, the more it happens. It's the reason why, and I hate to sound commercial, but we have a bonus even if people already subscribe. If you get onto it today, even if you extend for a 1-year subscription, you get a free back issue. For 3 years, it's already discounted, free back issue plus a free DVD. Plus, you can add a digital subscription for only $4 per year, and you can access it on up to 5 different devices, which means your children, grandchildren, cousin, whatever, can view their own copies. And our guys are going to send around these boards, and I need to explain a little bit about how it works. Once you've ticked the box as to what you want, do you want the digital or not, you then put the same on the right hand side, because that's a little tear off coupon, so that once you've put your details there, you tear it off. By the way, if you're going to subscribe, we do need your email address to save us money on subscription expiry notices and so on. That would be great. And while those boards are going around, I'll talk about some of the materials very briefly. Our intro pack is a really good starting point, because it's been specially discounted in this pack. It's not just the answers book that I mentioned, but also Refuting Evolution has been written, which is a compact, hard-hitting evolution demolition weapon written by Dr. Jonathan Safety, who's one of the smartest people I know. I mean, it's painful. You know, one of those people that not only thinks he knows everything about everything, but actually does. You know, that's very rare. I mean, I've watched him play chess against 12 people at once, and he's blindfolded, and they're not. And I watched him keep every move in his head on separate boards for 5 hours and beat them all. You know, I'm glad he's on our side anyway. Amen. But he's also got a gift of clear, concise communication, which is great. And he wrote this classic, Refuting Compromise. Now, if you got any doubts at all, or if you know people who are struggling with any of these theories, whether it's progressive creation or this theory or that theory, this will put it to rest. It's the leading theological, scientific affirmation of straightforward Genesis. When I say straightforward, you know, somebody says, I take the Bible in the literal sense. That can cause confusion, because some people will then say, oh, you mean you believe that the mountains clap their hands and all the rest of it. Well, you know what? Christians of the past, great writers of the past, when they said, I take it literally, what they meant was, I take it as what it literally means to tell me. If it's a parable or a figure of speech or a metaphor, it'll tell me that. So to avoid that confusion, we say plain sense, or in a straightforward sense. And what's more, Scripture interpreting Scripture, so that it all hangs together, which is really important. Here's a little brief one, a cheapie that I wrote, Stones and Bones. There's a whole little booklet series of this, but this covers the whole field in a compact way. The testimony of my accident, and the fact that I can vouch for the fact that having dealt with this issue and even preached on it about death and suffering and the gospel big picture, actually made a huge difference to me when I had my accident in coping. So it's not just an abstract theological issue. It has to do with real people in a real world of suffering. And there's the testimony on DVD if you're interested in things for small kids. You know, there's a lot of nice books for kids out there that are purely touchy-feely, you know. But kids have serious questions about God, don't they? And they have serious questions about things like death. But you know, you need to handle them sensitively, but you need to take those answers from Scripture. And who is God? What is death? The part of the Please Nana series. If you get those books, the cheapest way to get them is in that children's pack, where each of those 5 books sort of discounted down to only $8, and they're all hardcover. Even books on aliens, what's that got to do with this issue? Well, I was just reading yesterday a survey that said that the vast majority of people who believe in, well, put it a different way, that atheists are more likely to believe in aliens than religious people, and of all religious people, the least likely to believe in aliens or other superstitions are Bible-believing Christians, you know. And yet in our culture today, this evolution connection, you know, the fact that if life evolved here on Earth, well, there's lots of stars out there, lots of suns, maybe lots of planets, and so therefore it must have evolved out there somewhere. So, you know, they're hanging around waiting for E.T. But our kids today, if you poll young people, the vast majority will tell you, if you ask, how did we get here? Evolution. Number 2 answer is not created by God, but made by aliens. That's a sad indictment. So these are worldview issues. You're into things like physics and astronomy. We have books on dismantling the Big Bang. One of the co-authors of that is a physics professor from the University of Adelaide who speaks for us from time to time, Dr. John Hartnett. So, you don't need to leave your brains at the church door to believe the Bible just like it says. DVDs on all sorts of different topics. Again, they're cheaper, discounted down for that pack price. And don't forget the free stuff on creation.com. And let me just close with this verse from the Bible. And thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, and with all thy soul, and with all thy mind. All of those are important. And with all thy strength. This is the first commandment. Thank you very much.